The first season of Voltron was not released so long ago, but it certainly feels like a long time ago to me. I was a different person then in a different stage of my life. Not long before I had finished my first few viewings of Avatar and The Legend of Korra. This is notable because Voltron showrunners Lauren Montgomery and Joaquin Dos Santos both held high-ranking creative positions in The Legend of Korra. They're responsible for much of the feeling and tone of that show. They're arguably the two most important minds behind Korra other than Bryke. Even back in those days, I loved The Legend of Korra more than most because of its thematic ambition, its surprisingly subtle and philosophical character work, and most of all because of its willingness to thoughtfully and poignantly and viscerally depict the struggles of a particularly, specifically modern world. A world where fighting for justice and balance is much more complicated than merely defeating these antagonists. Yes, they do need to be defeated, but as important is what can be learned from them in order to build a greater ethic of what the world can look like and what goals and ideals it should be guided toward in an era where the old certainties and old customs have dropped away, and one cannot rely on these static ideas of what the Avatar should be. Rather, the role the Avatar holds in this modern world, in a world that has shaken itself free from these traditional customs and historical practices, is much more vague and amorphous. It's a difficult challenge in a more fractured world, and it requires taking from these different sources, these different wells of experience and ideology and perspective in order to create a comprehensive idea of what the world should be. It's much more complicated and politically subtle than a lot of critics have given it credit for, and even a lot of fans. The focus is not just on the need to draw knowledge from these different sources, and the need to form this new idea of what balance and harmony are, but also on why these new definitions are needed, why the old structures and old sources of wisdom can no longer be fully relied upon. They were sufficient in their time, but the age has changed. The world has become much more complicated now. It's a challenging show, even with its silly parts like the love triangles and the like. Even with its giant 100-foot-tall monster fights. It's ultimately a show about how to adapt to a world that has been displaced from these old structures, these old forms of understanding, where challenges of new ideologies, new viewpoints, result in the necessity to accept the challenge posed by those viewpoints and take from those viewpoints to create a positive, productive ideal of what the world should be. Not merely the simplistic ideal of defeating tyrants, however important that is. Even as I enter grad school, I look back to Korra quite often. I credit Korra in large part for inspiring my curiosity and my frustration with easy or dogmatic answers that I consider to be two of my best qualities. Surely they could recapture a lot of the magic of Korra in this glistening 80s-inspired sci-fi world, right? surely a sci-fi setting that affords a lot of space for thinking about these larger scale, more abstract and challenging ideas will fit the showrunning plans of Montgomery and Dos Santos, right? Well, it's more complicated than that. I think Voltron is not as bad as a lot of its critics made it out to be, especially in its last few seasons. There was a lot of vehement disdain thrown at Voltron, and much of it was undeserved, especially that directed at the showrunners and the actors. Harassment campaigns that cloak themselves in the language of justice and morality when they're really nothing but spiteful, solipsistic, and embittered are some of my least favorite things in the world. They disgrace the name of the values they claim to hold dear. Yes, the show perhaps could have handled its queer characters a little better. There are a few moments in the show that are much more awkward and clumsy than they should be. And yes, the marketing campaigns that arguably take advantage of the naive desires of a lot of these queer fans were a bit exploitative. I will go that far. But the amount of pure venom and pure moralistic, sanctimonious spite launched at the creators of the show is rather hideous. And it puts a real black mark on the show's fandom. Especially since so much of it that wasn't mere spite and arrogance, this inability to accept any creative decisions that are not what you personally would have liked. Even outside that, a lot of it just came down to shipping, came down to a lot of very dumb shipping discussions that I have no desire to relitigate. So when I think about the response the show received from fandom, that's mostly what I think of, which is unfortunate because there were a lot of thoughtful and considerate fan discussions had, both for the show and in criticism of it. With all that aside, is the show good? Well, that's a hard question. It is not as good as I hoped it would be. And a lot of the fans that say that the first two seasons were good, but then the show completely abandoned what made it work and caught itself up in a lot of moral dilemmas that it didn't quite know how to handle are mostly justified. The show was produced very quickly, it seems, and the release schedule for these seasons seemed rather harsh, with the entire show being released in the span of only a few years. Yet, a lot of what the show does holds up. At its best, the show can be quite enjoyable. It's ebullient and energetic. There's a sort of verve and a sort of imaginative intensity to it that recalls the original Star Trek at its best. If you watch the show as a Saturday morning cartoon, but better, cleaner, crisper, more energetic, with a greater sense of momentum and imagination, then the show mostly succeeds. If you watch it, like I was trying to at the start, expecting something of the philosophical and political intricacy of Korra, then you are going to be disappointed. The first two seasons of the show lay out a framework that the show could have and perhaps should have followed in its last six. It's a fun adventure. It relies on character dynamics that might not be that deep but are still enjoyable. It's fun for everyone with a lot of creativity and a lot of imagination and a few moments of daring, poignant beauty. When the show started to try for a bit more moral and intellectual complexity, it ran into some difficult issues. It was not quite prepared to handle the implications raised by characters like Lotor. The show positions Lotor as a kind of anti-hero who might not be this perfectly shining example of morality and goodness, but nonetheless has desires that are quite reasonable considering how fragmented and how warlike the world becomes after the end of Season 2. There are a lot of these different interests, and Lotor serves as a kind of uniting figure. He's a character that we're not really sure what to think about until the show backtracks on its complexity and tells you exactly what to think about him, and that's kind of a disappointment. I'm not saying the show needed to be more morally nuanced, but I'm saying that since it did decide to move away from these pat, reassuring bromides, move away from this platitudinous, dichotomous form of storytelling where there's a clear good guy and a clear bad guy, and everyone knows what the moral stakes are, that it really needed to do that better. I think of a lot of Marvel movies that set up villains with interesting issues and interesting questions, and then ultimately don't really deal with these issues because the villain is so horrible in what they want that they need to be defeated, and their issues, even ones that we might sympathize with, are never really dealt with. What I love about Korra is that it takes the ideas and concepts raised by these villains seriously. They have pointed critiques of the established order that need to be genuinely considered, not necessarily accepted, but responded to in a way that's not simply reifying the status quo. Korra, despite the inane criticism leveled at it, is not a show promoting the status quo. It is a show specifically demonstrating how the status quo needs to be moved away from, but that move away from the status quo needs to be done with wisdom and with a sort of nuance and a willingness to entertain a broad variety of perspectives. It's kind of Rawlsian in that regard. This show doesn't quite get there. And Seasons 7 and 8 are genuinely quite tedious. The show deserved a better ending. There are characters I love, like Allura, but ultimately they're not treated with the same level of depth and intricacy that the show acts like it's giving to them. And the show's finale is ultimately a little painful because it is obviously a reference to the Korra finale. It apes all of the beats from that finale, and yet, because there's a lack of pathos and a lack of moral complexity, it doesn't quite work as well. Still, there is a lot of good in the show, and what it does right should not be overshadowed either by its genuine shortcomings or especially by the rather exaggerated and histrionic fan furor that was kicked up during the last few seasons of the show. Give it a watch if you haven't seen it, or if you haven't seen it in a while. Look at it with fresh eyes. Anyway, tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon, promise you that. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.